In the hushed corridors of the Red Keep, quiet rumors were often more dangerous than open declarations. The walls had their ears, and every flickering torch, every stained glass window, seemed to keep its own counsel. Within the grand halls, the game of power turned day by day, propelled by secrets, alliances, and betrayals. It was in this volatile world that the union of King Joffrey Baratheon and Margaery Tyrell was celebrated with all the pageantry expected of a royal wedding. Those who watched from the sidelines saw only splendid gold and Tyrell roses, but beneath the bright surface, tension and ambition mingled like venom in a fine goblet of arbor wine. Margaery Tyrell, though young, had quickly gained a reputation for her keen political sense. She stepped into the role of queen not merely as a lady of courtesy but as a calculating presence, weaving her influence through acts of generosity and a knack for reading others' desires. Still, she was now tethered to Joffrey Baratheon, a boy king known throughout the Seven Kingdoms for his cruelty. Few could say whether Joffrey's vicious temperament was a reflection of his Lannister lineage or a personal spark of sadism that burned uniquely in him. Whispers behind closed doors speculated that, if the queen managed to subdue Joffrey's baser instincts with her softness, perhaps the kingdom might know peace. Others believed that any child born of that union was doomed to inherit the twisted inclinations that seethed beneath the surface of House Lannister's gilded facade. As days turned into weeks and weeks into moons, the court watched Margaery carefully. The Tyrell family had placed many hopes on her shoulders. She was to become more than simply Joffrey's wife. She was to solidify the alliance between Highgarden and King's Landing, ensuring the flow of grain, gold, and political leverage. For a brief period, it seemed that Margaery's gentle hand might coax a somewhat tamed version of Joffrey forth, at least in public. He still sneered and barked orders with little compassion, but the rumors of him taking crossbow practice on stray cats or beating servants with impunity grew less frequent. Whether that was Margaery's doing or Tywin Lannister's stern watchfulness was a point of contention. Tywin sought to maintain the royal image, after all, and the hand of the king had no patience for any scandal that might undermine the power of House Lannister. Yet behind the closed doors of their bedchamber, Margaery's influence on Joffrey was limited. She tried to mollify him with flattery and sweet words, feigning to enjoy his company, but there were nights his temper flared, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar spark of cruelty. She learned to navigate his outbursts with all the grace she could muster, always reminding herself that her house depended on her ability to endure. And then, scarcely a year into their marriage, Margaery bore news that would change the future of the realm forever. She was with child. She first felt the stirring of suspicion when her monthly flux did not appear. In the privacy of her chamber, she examined her symptoms, the faint spells of nausea, the subtle ache in her breasts, the heavy fatigue that draped her by early afternoon. The maester assigned to her soon confirmed it. A hush fell over her, excitement mingling with dread. She knew that for many, a queen's pregnancy was a moment of celebration, a future heir to the Iron Throne, a sign of the dynasty's continuation. But it also meant that if this child were indeed Joffrey's, the child might inherit all that was dark and corrupt in him. Margaery felt a deep chill settle over her heart, understanding that she had a duty to the kingdom, but also a silent prayer that her child might be spared the viciousness that seemed to run in the royal line. When Joffrey received word, his excitement was more akin to a wild flare of glee than any paternal tenderness. He strutted through the halls, head high, eyes bright with a strange mixture of pride and ruthlessness. He boasted of the power his son would wield. He made mention of knights kneeling before the royal cradle, swearing fealty to the might of House Baratheon and House Lannister. His laughter echoed through the throne room when, in private moments, he rambled about how his heir would be unstoppable with the full might of the crown behind him. To Margaery's relief, he also seemed, for a short time, more amenable. For all his sadism, Joffrey did harbor a desire to prove himself a true king in the eyes of his father's legacy, or what he believed was his father's legacy. The realm whispered that Robert Baratheon had not truly sired him. But those rumors were treason, of course, and no one dared speak them openly. In the months of her pregnancy, Margaery found some relief in the memory of Sansa Stark, who had once been promised to Joffrey. Sansa had learned, in her own frightened way, how to survive in the presence of the Boy King. Though Margaery had not known Sansa intimately, she had gleaned from the girl's sad eyes the truth of Joffrey's temperament. Now, with each passing day, Margaery realized that her wiles had to be even subtler than Sansa's demure compliance. She sought to shape the conditions in which her child would be raised. She insisted, gently but firmly, on selecting the most capable maester for the child's care and the most patient septas to attend to its education. While Joffrey was swayed by her flattery, she made small but meaningful inroads, ensuring that not every source of influence around the child would be a reflection of cruelty and force. Within the Red Keep, the tensions between the Tyrells and the Lannisters persisted in quiet ways. Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, who had initially played a large hand in orchestrating Margaery's marriage to Joffrey, visited under the guise of concern for her granddaughter's health. She brought honeyed sweets and cunning words, letting them drip casually in conversation, but her real objective was to measure how the Lannisters were reacting to the news of the royal heir. She was too clever to believe that all was well just because there were no outward displays of hostility. Cersei Lannister's eyes flashed jealousy at the thought that Margaery would be mother to the king's first child. Jaime Lannister loomed about, offering a protective presence for his nephew, one that was complicated by deeper, more scandalous truths that only a few dared suspect. Tywin Lannister was, as always, solemnly fixated on the future of the family line. He convened council meetings, ensuring that the realm would remain stable in anticipation of the new heir. There were plans for strengthening alliances with major houses. The Tyrells, for their part, saw an opportunity to weave themselves ever closer to the Iron Throne. Margaery's child, after all, would tie Highgarden and King's Landing in ways that could not be easily undone. At last, after a difficult labor that had both the maesters and Margaery's ladies in waiting on edge for many hours, Margaery birthed a son. The child was slight at first, with a tuft of golden hair so bright it seemed spun from sunlight. Joffrey stared down at his heir with an intensity that made more than one attendant shiver. His joy was not the gentle warmth of a new father, but a fierce, possessive pride. He named the boy Prince Maegor, evoking a Targaryen name from generations past, though the choice was startling, and none dared publicly question it. Margaery was not pleased with the name's history, for Maegor Targaryen had been known as Maegor the Cruel. She sensed Joffrey had chosen that name for a reason. It was almost like an omen, a direction for the child's future rather than a simple name. Yet Margaery had little say when Joffrey's mind was made up. Even if she disagreed, no one at court wanted to defy the king. So the child was anointed Maegor, and from that day forward, the entire court waited and watched, breath bated, to see just who Maegor might become. Margaery, once recovered from the birth, began her subtle work to safeguard Maegor's upbringing. She used her charm and alliances to keep the boy surrounded by tutors who understood kindness and justice, or at least valued them. She spun a cocoon of care around him, hoping that her influence, along with those few gentler souls in the Red Keep, would counterbalance whatever darkness might lurk in the blood he carried from his father. But it was not so simple. Joffrey demanded time with his son, parading him before the court as often as possible. He loved the spectacle of the people bowing to the cradle, the hush that fell when the tiny prince was carried through the throne room. And as soon as Maegor could stand, Joffrey insisted on giving him toy swords, pushing him toward any display of aggression that might amuse the king. From an early age, Maegor showed a sharp intelligence. He watched everything around him with an almost unsettling focus, as though he were always calculating some puzzle. He formed words quickly and began to speak in short sentences before many children said their first coherent phrase. Margaery saw it as a blessing. Perhaps this intelligence would allow him to see beyond the petty games of brutality his father played. But she also saw hints of something else, something that made her uneasy when she looked into the boy's eyes and found them eerily steady and unflinching. One day, when Maegor was just 3, he slid a wooden sword into the seam of a seamstress's skirt as a prank, causing the woman to trip and fall. The courtyard erupted in shock. Joffrey, standing on a balcony above, burst into peals of laughter, clapping his hands in delight. Margaery, alarmed, tried to hide her distress. Yes, it was the sort of childhood prank one might expect from a rambunctious boy, but the calculated look in Maegor's eyes afterward, as he evaluated the consequences, haunted her. By the time Maegor turned 5, the rumors of the little lion's cunning spread through the Red Keep. The stable boys claimed he enjoyed watching the caged animals fight over scraps of meat. The kitchen servants murmured that he rarely smiled except when something disquieting happened in his presence. And at tourney feasts, Joffrey proudly displayed the boy, letting him walk through the lines of knights who bowed low, letting him poke at their armor with curious fingers. Some knights were disturbed by the intensity with which Maegor stared at them, as though memorizing every seam of their protective steel. Margaery fought at every turn to nurture the gentleness within him. She told him stories of knights who were guided by honor and compassion. Ser Barristan Selmy, Ser Arthur Dane. She tried to make him understand the virtue of protecting the weak. Yet so much of Maegor's world was shaped by the king and, more subtly, by the Queen Regent's mother, Cersei Lannister. The Queen Grandmother took delight in spoiling the child with expensive gifts. Golden lion trinkets, a small dagger encrusted with rubies, miniature crossbows, and lavish doublets embroidered with the regal heraldry of both the Baratheon stag and the Lion of Lannister. Olenna Tyrell, on her visits, would cast a critical eye on such gifts, making japes about Lannister ostentation. But though she tried to slip in her own influence with gentle toys and books, it was clear that Joffrey's side overshadowed any attempt the Tyrells made to cultivate compassion. As the boy reached the age of 7, it was decided that he would begin proper training in arms. The courtyard was his new domain. His instructors were seasoned men, sworn to serve the crown, and they approached the young prince with caution. The child was not large for his age, but there was a wiry determination in him. He had keen reflexes, perhaps even the beginnings of real skill. Day after day, he trained with wooden swords, absorbing technique swiftly. He never cried out if he was struck. He gritted his teeth, meeting each lesson with an intense self-discipline. Joffrey would watch sometimes, perched in a chair or leaning against a column, arms folded, expression gleeful when Maegor lashed out with a particularly quick strike. Margaery attended the sessions as well, though she tried to remain on the sidelines, reminding her son afterwards that the strength of a true knight lay in honor, not just skill with a blade. One evening, after a day's training in the yard, Maegor approached his mother in her sitting room. Margaery noticed the sweat slicking his golden hair to his forehead, and the faint bruise on his left cheek from a sparring accident. She reached out to dab at it with a damp cloth, but he pulled away, small lips setting in a firm line. It was not quite defiance. It was more guarded, as though he did not want to appear weak before her. They spoke of his lessons, and she tried to coax him into discussing how he felt about them. All he said was that he wanted to be stronger. Margaery placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that mercy was sometimes a greater strength than brute force. He stared at her with eyes that seemed too old for a child of 7, and he simply nodded without a word. In the days that followed, Margaery noticed a shift in Joffrey's behavior as well. He seemed vexed that Maegor had not displayed more outward cruelty. "I was already punishing servants and feeding them to the hounds at his age," Joffrey boasted one night, though Margaery suspected it was an exaggeration. Nonetheless, the point stood. He wanted his son to show the same savage flair he believed he himself possessed. But a child's nature could be complex, shaped by myriad forces. Maegor was neither gentle nor openly sadistic in the way Joffrey was. Instead, he seemed to watch and learn, calculating which behaviors gained him approval or advantage. It was this quiet cunning that made Margaery fear for the future more than if he had simply been a smaller version of Joffrey. When Maegor turned 8, a grand feast was held in King's Landing to celebrate his name day. Lords and ladies from every corner of the realm gathered in the Red Keep's great hall, dressed in finery that shimmered under the candlelight. Musicians played lively tunes, jugglers performed for the royal table, and the smell of roasted boar and spiced wine filled the air. Joffrey, in high spirits, decided to gift his son a real steel sword, child-sized, but deadly nonetheless. He presented it before the gathered crowd, raising it high for all to see, the polished blade catching the torchlight in a dazzling flash. Maegor took the weapon with a solemn bow of his head, while applause echoed through the hall. Margaery's heart twisted. She stood at Joffrey's side, forced to smile, but dread clung to her. A steel sword for an 8-year-old was a dangerous toy, especially for one being shaped so deliberately for power. After the feast, they held a small demonstration in the courtyard so that Maegor could show off his swordsmanship. He faced off against a squire several years older, though the squire was instructed to go easy on the prince. The entire court watched from balconies and archways. Joffrey cheered with savage delight as steel clashed against steel, the ring of metal echoing in the night air. Maegor moved with surprising speed. Despite his smaller stature, he wielded the child's sword almost as though it were an extension of his own arm. He ducked under the squire's cautious swings and then darted forward to tap the older boy's ribs with a flat strike. The crowd gasped, and Joffrey laughed. On the third exchange, Maegor lunged too aggressively, and the squire, startled, reacted on instinct, slashing across the young prince's forearm. Blood dripped onto the stones, a vivid red against the moonlit courtyard. Silence fell, and panic fluttered among the spectators. Margaery rushed forward, but Joffrey raised a hand to hold her back. Maegor stared at his wound for a long moment before he turned his eyes toward the squire. For a heartbeat, it looked as though the boy might cry from the pain, but instead he advanced, ignoring the blood, and pressed his blade to the squire's throat. The older boy froze, eyes wide with terror, uncertain whether he would face the king's wrath if he defended himself. Maegor's breathing was heavy, each ragged breath spurred by pain, yet his gaze was determined, unyielding. Finally, with a swift jerk, he pulled his sword away. A hush hovered in the air, an uneasy tension passing through the onlookers. Joffrey was beaming, pride lighting his features. Margaery could not hide the alarm in her own eyes. The wound was tended, and the festivities continued, but the incident did not fade from memory. It whispered across the corridors of the Red Keep, and from there out to the city. Word spread that the young prince had faced a real injury and had reacted with a cold, startling composure. Some said it was a sign of great potential, a brave prince forging his legend. Others found it unsettling, a hint that the cruelty in House Lannister's line had taken root in him. Margaery tried to comfort her son that night, dressing his bandage with a mother's care, speaking softly to him about the importance of controlling one's anger. But he barely responded, lost in thought, perhaps replaying the moment when he had a blade at another boy's throat. When the conversation ended, he merely gazed at her, then slipped into bed, silent as a specter. The following years brought more turmoil to the realm. The Iron Bank of Bravos had begun to press the crown for the debts accrued by Robert Baratheon's reign and further inflated under Joffrey's rule. Tensions flared in the north, as houses loyal to the remaining Starks grumbled about the conditions placed upon them since the War of the Five Kings. The Stormlands had grown restless, uncertain about the Lannister hold on the throne. Through it all, Tywin Lannister kept a tight watch, using diplomacy and threats in equal measure. But Tywin was aging, and the burden on him was heavier with each passing moon. Joffrey was never the king Tywin had wanted. He was too unpredictable and savage. Nevertheless, Tywin insisted on forging stability, if only so that the monarchy would not collapse upon itself. Amid this backdrop of political tensions, Prince Maegor continued to grow. By 10, he was training in more advanced swordsmanship under the direction of the Kingsguard, and Jaime Lannister took a special interest in instructing the boy. Jaime saw in him a chance to shape a warrior with potential, someone who might excel beyond the child King Joffrey had once been. Jaime had no illusions about the child's paternal lineage. He knew better than anyone that Joffrey was not Robert's son but his own. Yet it mattered little to the realm. The lines were blurred, and Maegor was recognized as the rightful heir by law and tradition. The boy's temperament intrigued Jaime. He recognized echoes of Joffrey's cruelty, but also a calculating edge that surpassed Joffrey's brashness. He often wondered how much Margaery's influence had tempered the worst impulses. One afternoon, Jaime and Maegor were sparring in the courtyard. Margaery watched from the shade of an archway, her face a careful mask of composure. She observed how Jaime corrected the boy's stance, how Maegor adjusted seamlessly, and then how he pressed forward in a relentless flurry of strikes. Despite Jaime's reputation as a master swordsman, he let the boy gain small victories to encourage him. When they paused for breath, Jaime offered a bit of advice on footwork. Maegor listened intently, nodded, and resumed with no sign of complaint or fatigue. When the session ended, Maegor gave Jaime a short bow, then walked away to wipe his brow. Before he left the courtyard, he glanced at his mother. Margaery smiled gently, but he did not return it. He turned on his heel and left. That evening, Margaery invited Jaime to speak privately. They met in a small solar, the stone walls lit by a single lantern. She thanked him for training the prince, for offering guidance that might keep him from turning into a mindless brute. Jaime shrugged, leaning against the wall, golden hand glinting in the lamplight. He admitted that Maegor was shaping up to be formidable. But then he paused, a worried line creasing his brow, and said that the boy's eyes were too guarded for a child, that he rarely seemed to fight out of passion or joy. Instead, it was like he treated each lesson as a step towards some distant objective. Margaery's heart sank, for she had sensed the same. She prayed that if Maegor had ambitions, they would not be fueled by a darker fire she'd feared for so long. Time flowed onward, as it always did in Westeros, carrying wars and alliances on its tide. Maegor reached his 12th name day. He stood taller now, his hair still that brilliant gold, face narrower and framed by cheekbones that mirrored the Lannister line. Margaery saw her own grace in him sometimes, a certain tilt of the chin, a subtle refinement of feature. Yet his eyes remained the steel gray of the Lannisters, sharper than any sword he wielded. At court, some described him as a perfect blend of lion and rose, a testament to the union of Lannister and Tyrell. Others said the rose in him had wilted, leaving only the sharp brambles of ambition. On the day of his 12th name-day feast, Margaery planned a lavish celebration in the gardens. She hoped the blossoming flowers, the sweet scents of honeysuckle and lemon cakes, the laughter of courtiers, and the presence of a traveling troupe of minstrels might fill the air with warmth and mitigate the ever-lingering tensions. For a time, it worked. Lords and ladies strolled through the manicured hedges, sampling arbor red wine, exchanging pleasant chatter. Maegor stood near the main fountain, dressed in a green doublet embroidered with golden lions and stags, a nod to his father's heraldry. When approached by well-wishers, he bowed politely or offered curt thanks, but rarely a smile. Some took this as regal composure, others wondered if his heart was as cold as rumored. Joffrey, of course, disliked the softness of a garden party, preferring the spectacle of violence or intimidation. But he tolerated Margaery's plan for the sake of appearances, grumbling here and there about how the boy needed to see proper entertainment. At length, unable to contain himself, Joffrey arranged a surprise. When the minstrels finished their set of jaunty tunes, he declared that his son's name day would be honored with a display of caged animals, exotic creatures brought from across the sea. Margaery felt her stomach churn. She had not been informed of this. Joffrey commanded that the cages be brought into the courtyard and lined up for Maegor to examine. Huddled within were strange animals. A cowering striped cat from the Summer Isles, a battered Ibonese goat, and a sleek black panther rumored to hail from Sithorios. At first, nothing happened beyond gawking. Courtiers approached with wide eyes, marveling at the beasts. Then Joffrey, with a wicked grin, announced that they would stage a fight between two of these creatures in the custom of barbaric pits found in lesser lands. He turned to his son, offering him the privilege of choosing which animals would battle. A hush fell over the crowd. This was a test, a twisted challenge from father to son. Margaery stepped forward, trying to intervene. She spoke lightly, suggesting that perhaps they should not torment creatures that had been taken from their homes. Joffrey's glare cut her words short. The king's lips curled in annoyance. Maegor stood, expression unreadable, as he considered his father's demand. Joffrey's eyes gleamed, half in excitement, half in a dare, challenging the boy to show the court what kind of prince he was. Slowly, Maegor approached the line of cages. He paused before the panther's cage. The creature hissed, its black fur bristling. Then he moved to the striped cat from the Summer Isles, which seemed smaller, frightened, hugging the bars of its cage. The onlookers tensed, anticipating some gruesome spectacle. Margaery held her breath, heart pounding. Finally, Maegor turned away from the cages. His face betrayed no emotion as he looked to his father. In a calm voice, he declared that he would have no animals fight on his name day, for such a performance was beneath the dignity of the crown. The crowd released a collective breath. Some let relief wash over them, though not all. Joffrey's expression darkened. Margaery felt a wave of gratitude that her son had not chosen to indulge Joffrey's cruelty. But she also sensed a tension in Maegor's voice that worried her, as if his decision was not born of compassion but of a different calculation. Joffrey, dismayed, spat that he thought he had raised a stronger son. An uncomfortable silence fell across the garden. Maegor, staring at his father with an unwavering gaze, replied that there were ways to display strength that did not involve trivial savagery. A few courtiers dared to murmur approval, while others shrank back, fearful of Joffrey's reaction. A faint flush of anger colored the king's cheeks, but with so many nobles present, he could not lash out too violently. So he forced a laugh, dismissing the event as if it were all in jest. But a current of tension rippled beneath the merriment for the rest of the evening. In the days after, Joffrey's temper simmered. He distanced himself from Maegor, ignoring him in the corridors and turning his back when the boy entered the throne room. Margaery hoped that the rift would protect Maegor from further malignant influence. She also hoped that Maegor's decision, even if partially political, hinted there was some moral compass within him. But she remained uneasy, aware that Joffrey's wrath could manifest in unpredictable ways. Sure enough, Joffrey soon began meddling in the boy's martial training again, demanding that the master-at-arms teach him harsher lessons, encouraging him to spar with grown knights, urging humiliations to toughen him up. It was as if he wanted to break the boy's composure, to ensure that cruelty would win out in his son's heart. Meanwhile, Margaery spent as much time as she could in Maegor's company, reading him tales of heroic kings who protected their people, of wise rulers who treated even the lowliest subjects with justice. Maegor listened quietly, his eyes ever watchful. Now and then, he would ask incisive questions. Did such a king ever face treachery from his own family? How did a ruler punish those who betrayed the crown? What if a king's father was not fit to rule? Margaery found these questions haunting, but she answered as best she could, emphasizing wisdom and fairness. Maegor's stare never wavered, and she could not help but wonder what lay behind those questions. When Maegor turned 14, he was officially recognized as a squire to a member of the Kingsguard. Though Joffrey initially wanted him to serve under someone more malicious, perhaps to cultivate harshness, Tywin Lannister intervened, insisting on a measured path. Tywin, always the strategist, believed that the realm would respect the boy more if he learned proper knightly conduct. Ironically. So Maegor was placed in the service of Ser Balon Swan, a knight known for his skill and, to some extent, his honor. Under Ser Balon's tutelage, the prince learned discipline, chivalric codes, and battlefield tactics. Maegor excelled swiftly, surpassing many other squires in the realm. Yet there was still that disquieting aura about him. He was too poised, too cold. He rarely showed rage, but nor did he show compassion. His actions were almost always precise and calculated. It was during this period that Margaery's influence hit a wall of sorts. The boy was growing into a young man, forming his own judgments and forging his own path. He still treated his mother with a kind of distant respect, but he no longer confided in her. She tried to draw him out, to remind him that goodness was not a weakness. But he would merely nod, or occasionally offer a bland reassurance that he understood. In her heart, she sensed that he did not fully embrace her words. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand on a balcony overlooking the sea of lights that was King's Landing, wondering if her attempts to temper his nature had only honed his ability to hide what truly stirred in him. When he was 15, A new war threatened to engulf the realm. One of the Targaryen pretenders across the narrow sea declared himself the rightful heir, claiming to be a lost child of Rhaegar Targaryen. Though many dismissed it as yet another false claimant, others flocked to the banner, eager for a cause that might unseat the Lannisters. Tensions ran high, and Joffrey declared that if the so-called Targaryen rebel ever set foot on Westeros, he would crush him. The king prepared for war, calling banners, training new levies. The Tyrells were asked for men, gold, and provisions, which they provided, albeit with caution. Margaery watched the mobilization, anxious that the realm might tear itself apart once more. Amid the war preparations, Joffrey decided it was time for Maegor to display his prowess in a tournament. The prince had grown proficient enough to hold his own against seasoned knights in practice. Joffrey wanted to see if the boy could do so before the eyes of the realm. While Margaery worried that such a public event could provoke trouble, she had little power to stop it. Soon the lists were set, and knights and squires from all over the Seven Kingdoms converged on King's Landing for the grand spectacle. Maegor, though not yet a knight, was allowed to compete in the squires' melee and the archery contests. The day of the tournament dawned bright and searingly hot. Banners of gold, crimson, and green fluttered in the breeze. The stands were packed with lords and ladies. Small folk squeezed onto benches to witness the glorious violence. Joffrey presided over it all from a royal box, with Margaery at his side, resplendent in a gown of pale green embroidered with roses. Maegor entered the lists, wearing a light suit of armor in the Lannister gold, sword at his hip. Margaery's heart pounded with a mix of dread and pride. She glanced at Joffrey to see him leaning forward in anticipation. The squire's melee was a brutal affair, a swirling chaos of steel and dust as young men fought to be the last standing. Maegor moved like a serpent among them, striking quickly, dodging with uncanny reflexes. One by one, other squires fell to his blade or were beaten into yielding. Margaery could barely watch, her stomach knotted. When the dust settled, Maegor stood victorious, sword pointed at his final opponent's chest. A roaring cheer burst from the crowd. Joffrey leapt to his feet, applauding, a wide grin splitting his face. Margaery forced herself to stand and clap as well, though she felt cold inside. The way Maegor held his sword to the defeated boy's throat was disturbingly reminiscent of that time in the courtyard when he was just 8. Afterwards, in the archery contest, Maegor again excelled. His aim was precise, each arrow slicing through the air to bury itself near the center of the target. He finished second overall, beaten only by an older boy rumored to practice daily with a master archer from the Stormlands. Still, the display left no doubt. The prince was skilled, dangerously so. Whispers rippled through the stands that he would grow to be a warrior king, perhaps more fearsome than any in recent memory. That evening, the victors were toasted at a lavish feast. Lords jostled for proximity to Prince Maegor, praising him, offering well wishes, hinting at alliances. Maegor responded politely, though he never once appeared flustered or uncertain. Watching him, Margaery realized with a pang that her son was no longer a child who could be guided with motherly reassurance. He was forging his own destiny, his own brand of power and ruthlessness. Yet she still clung to the hope that some measure of empathy existed within him. As the feast wore on, wine flowed freely, tongues loosened, and tensions found their way into the open. A lord from the Vale muttered something disparaging about the Tyrells, prompting a counter from Loras Tyrell, Margaery's brother, who was still a renowned knight. The conversation escalated into a heated argument, and soon enough, Joffrey was goading them to settle their dispute with a duel. Loras refused, mindful that this was not the place or time, but Joffrey mocked him as a coward. It was only when Maegor stood, placing a steady hand on his father's wrist, that Joffrey grudgingly relented. The moment passed, but not without leaving behind a disquiet. Margaery felt an odd gratitude that Maegor had intervened, even if it was only to prevent a drunken spectacle. Night deepened, and the feast drew to a close. Guests trickled out, servants cleared away goblets and plates, and torches sputtered in the breeze. Margaery retired to her chambers, weary and troubled, too restless to sleep. She sat by the window, gazing at the black sky pricked by stars. A soft knock sounded on the door. She rose, unfastening the latch to find Maegor standing there. He still wore his doublet, slightly disheveled from the festivities. She ushered him in, concerned by the grave look on his face. He asked if they could speak in private, and she assured him they could. They settled by the dying embers in the hearth. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Maegor quietly voiced a question that startled her. Did she think the people truly loved King Joffrey? Margaery answered with diplomatic caution, explaining that people respected the crown, feared Joffrey's power, but love was more complicated. The memory of King Robert's more boisterous but occasionally generous rule lingered in the city's mind. Joffrey, by contrast, had done little to earn genuine affection. Maegor listened, face unreadable. He asked if she believed that cruelty was the only path to rule. She replied that while fear could secure obedience, a wise ruler would temper it with fairness or risk rebellion. Maegor's gaze flickered with something she couldn't place. He thanked her for her honesty. Before leaving, he said that he wanted the 7 kingdoms to prosper, that he wanted to be a king people did not mock or despise. Margaery's heart soared briefly, thinking maybe her influence had finally begun to bear fruit. She asked him to remember that mercy, justice, and patience were not weaknesses. He nodded and pressed a brief kiss to her hand, a gesture that recalled a younger boy who once looked to her for comfort. Then he slipped out into the corridor, leaving Margaery alone with a swirl of hope and apprehension. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and in that time, Maegor continued to squire for Ser Balon Swan, occasionally venturing beyond the capital for short campaigns to quell raids or rebellious pockets. Each time he returned to King's Landing, Margaery noted subtle changes, a harder set to his jaw, and even more guarded watchfulness in his gaze. But he never lost his composure, never descended into the public tantrums or violent outrages that characterized Joffrey's youth. Perhaps that was more dangerous. One brisk morning, word reached King's Landing that the Targaryen pretender had landed in the Stormlands with a modest force, seeking to rally loyalists. Joffrey summoned his council, bristling at the challenge, eager to march the royal army against this threat. Tywin, though older, remained a formidable strategist. He advised caution, urging a measured approach. Joffrey grew impatient, demanding a grand show of force. He wanted to lead the army himself, to ride out and crush the pretender in a swift blow that would demonstrate his might. Margaery saw the arrogance in his stance, the same arrogance that had led him into near disaster during the Battle of the Blackwater years before. The assembled lords eyed one another uneasily. Finally, to the surprise of many, Maegor spoke up. He suggested that a direct assault might be unwise if they did not know the full extent of the pretender's allies. He proposed instead to use scouts, to spread false information about the location of the crown's main force, to draw the pretender into a vulnerable position. A hush followed. Joffrey glared at his son, irritated at being contradicted in public. But Tywin latched onto the idea, praising its cunning. He elaborated on how they could use smaller divisions of the army to encircle the pretender's forces once they marched into a trap. With Tywin's endorsement, the plan was agreed upon. Joffrey had little choice but to acquiesce, though his jaw clenched as if he could barely stand that his son's counsel overshadowed his own. That night, Margaery found Maegor alone in the library, poring over maps and histories of past rebellions. She complimented his strategy, but also cautioned him that cunning without conscience could lead to tyranny. He listened, then asked her if she believed it was better to end a war swiftly with minimal overall bloodshed, even if it meant deceiving the enemy, rather than prolonging a campaign through honorable but predictable tactics. Margaery conceded that war was never simple, and sometimes deception spared more lives. Maegor nodded as though her words affirmed his path. She felt a pang, wondering if she was unwittingly justifying a path that would lead him to become like Tywin, a figure respected for cunning, but feared and loathed by many. The plan was set in motion. Scouts fanned out, misinformation was sown, and soon rumors spread that the royal army was stationed far to the north. The Targaryen pretender, emboldened, advanced deeper into the Stormlands, hoping to rally local lords. But many of those lords remained loyal, or at least nominally so, to the crown, and they hesitated to commit to a losing side. Maegor, though still only a squire, accompanied the main force under the banner of King Joffrey and Lord Tywin. Margaery feared letting him go, but there was no choice. He was the crown prince, expected to stand beside his father in times of war. The confrontation occurred on a barren plain near the ruins of Summerhall. The Pretender's forces were outnumbered and disorganized. When the trap was sprung, the Crown's army closed in from multiple sides, pinning them in place. A fierce clash erupted, steel ringing on steel, cries of anguish echoing across the field. Joffrey, clad in ornate armor, rode at the head of the charge, thirsting for glory. He cut down a few hapless soldiers with a twisted grin, while the gold-cloaked men roared behind him. Nearby, Maegor fought with a calm efficiency that unsettled those who saw him. He showed no wild rage, no bloodthirsty glee. Instead, he moved like a well-trained assassin, cutting through enemies with precise, fluid strokes, each blow aimed to incapacitate or kill with minimal wasted energy. The battle was short-lived. Surrounded and outmatched, the Pretender's ranks crumbled. The rebel leader himself, wearing partial Targaryen regalia, tried to rally his remaining men for a final stand. But Joffrey's cavalry broke through, and soon the Pretender was unhorsed, pinned in the mud. According to later accounts, Joffrey dismounted, strolled up to the fallen man, and looked into his eyes with a triumphant sneer. The Pretender cursed him, calling him a usurper, a false Baratheon. Joffrey responded by slowly sliding a dagger between the man's ribs. The battlefield quieted as the rebels' dying screams subsided. Soldiers stood witness, many trembling at the king's cold brutality. Maegor arrived at the scene moments later, sword dripping with blood. He stared at the dying Pretender, then at Joffrey, whose lips were curved in a grin of mad satisfaction. Something flickered in the prince's expression, though none present could interpret it. With the rebellion quashed, the survivors surrendered. Joffrey ordered many of them executed on the spot. Maegor stepped forward, suggesting that some of the Stormlanders might be spared, as they had been conscripted or coerced. Joffrey, riding the high of victory, laughed in his face, proclaiming that mercy was for the weak. The king's crossbowmen unleashed volleys, cutting down any survivors who dared raise their hands for clemency. Maegor's jaw tightened, but he did not speak again. The victorious army returned to King's Landing, parading captured banners and spoils of war. The city cheered, though whether out of genuine support or fear was uncertain. Joffrey took full credit for the strategy, boasting of his cunning and unstoppable might. Tywin tolerated it, letting the king have his moment, for in the end, Lannister power had been reinforced. Maegor rode near the back of the procession, helmet obscuring his expression. When Margaery greeted him in the courtyard, she noticed a distant look in his eyes, as though something weighed heavily upon him. Late that night, Maegor confronted Joffrey in the king's private chambers. Accounts of the conversation came only in whispers, gleaned by servants who overheard shouting. Maegor accused his father of needless cruelty and of discounting advice given by the council regarding the treatment of captured rebels. Joffrey retorted that a king did what he wished, without question from a mere boy. Their voices rose to shouts, and at one point there was a crash. The next morning, rumors abounded of broken furniture in the king's chambers. Some claimed that Maegor had lifted a table and hurled it aside in anger. Others said Joffrey had thrown a golden goblet at Maegor. No one knew the full truth, but tension was clear. The father and son had clashed openly, and it would not soon be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Joffrey's paranoia grew. He suspected that Maegor was too popular with the men, too respected among the lords. Servants heard him muttering about betrayal in the night, about how family members had turned on each other in Westeros' bloody history. Cersei, grown older but no less protective of Joffrey, fueled his fears, warning him that a son who questioned him openly might one day covet the throne. Tywin, sensing the brewing conflict, tried to intervene behind closed doors, insisting that the king show reason. But Joffrey was never one to heed logic when his pride was wounded. Maegor turned 16. Custom dictated that, if deemed worthy, he might be knighted. Many whispered that he deserved it after his prowess in battle. Yet Joffrey withheld his approval. He claimed that the boy had not proved himself sufficiently loyal. The slight was obvious to all, and it caused murmurs throughout the court. Margaery attempted to intercede, speaking gently to Joffrey, trying to coax him into seeing that knighting Maegor would only strengthen the crown's image. But the king bristled, blaming her for coddling the boy. In a fit of temper, he ordered her to stay out of men's matters, then stormed away. Seeing no immediate solution, Margaery resolved to keep a close eye on both father and son. She feared a confrontation that might tear the family and the realm apart. She confided in Olenna Tyrell, who had grown older but no less sharp. The Queen of Thorns offered a pragmatic perspective. If Joffrey pushed Maegor too far, the realm might see the boy as a preferable ruler. But that could ignite a civil war. Olenna commented wryly that if Margaery truly wanted to avoid strife, she should have used a stronger poison on Joffrey years ago. It was, of course, a half-joke loaded with truth. Margaery scolded her grandmother for such a remark, though deep down she understood the sentiment. Fate, as it often did in Westeros, moved swiftly in unexpected ways. While Joffrey's paranoia simmered, a new threat arose in the Iron Islands, where raiders seized the momentary distraction of the crown to plunder the western coasts. Again, the banners were called, and Joffrey prepared to lead a punitive expedition. Despite his growing suspicion of his son, Joffrey could not openly exclude Maegor without appearing weak. So father and son rode to war once more, heading for the shores of the Sunset Sea to confront the Ironborn. The campaign lasted several arduous weeks, with skirmishes along the rocky coasts. Maegor once again distinguished himself with tactical prowess. He ambushed raiding parties, reclaimed stolen cargo, and secured critical vantage points with minimal losses. Meanwhile, Joffrey led frontal assaults, often incurring heavier casualties but relishing the bloodshed. The tension between them built daily, each subtle success of Maegor's fueling Joffrey's resentful glare. Soldiers remarked that they had never seen such a stark contrast between two leaders, one savage and unpredictable, the other icily methodical. Then, in a battle near Lordsport, Joffrey's personal guard was caught in a trap. Ironborn reavers sprang from hidden tunnels, encircling the king's position. Cut off from reinforcements, Joffrey faced overwhelming odds. In desperation, his men formed a shield wall, trying to buy time. Word reached Maegor, who commanded a nearby flank. Without hesitation, he led his knights in a swift, coordinated charge that flanked the Ironborn. The maneuver broke the Reavers' formation, saving the king. Joffrey survived, albeit wounded. An axe to the leg left him bleeding and in agony. The king's men carried him from the battlefield, while Maegor regrouped and led the final push to drive the Ironborn back to their ships. In the aftermath, Joffrey lay in a makeshift command tent, legs swathed in bandages, his face pale from blood loss. Tywin and maesters crowded around him, trying to stabilize the wound. Maegor arrived, covered in dust and splattered with blood, but otherwise unharmed. He gazed at his father, who groaned in pain, half-conscious. Soldiers and knights around them murmured that Maegor had saved the king's life. Tywin, stoic as ever, nodded in approval. But when Joffrey came to, his eyes met Maegor's, and instead of gratitude, there was a flicker of resentment. A father should not owe his life to a son he feared might one day surpass him. The fighting concluded soon after, with a tenuous agreement reached in which the Ironborn withdrew to their isles. The crown's forces returned to the mainland. Joffrey was carried in a litter, legs still healing, rage festering. Maegor rode at the head of a victorious column, hailed by the men as the real hero of the campaign. The seeds of discord were unmistakable. They arrived back in King's Landing under a bright sun that did little to warm the frost between father and son. Courtiers poured out to welcome them, but the king's foul mood was evident. He holed up in his chambers, refusing all but the most essential visitors. Margaery hurried to meet him, but was turned away by Cersei, who claimed Joffrey needed rest. Meanwhile, Tywin offered public praise for Maegor's deeds, fueling the talk that the prince was the true protector of the realm. Some said it was Tywin's way of humbling Joffrey, or perhaps ensuring a stable transition of power in the future. In the days that followed, Joffrey's wound festered. The maesters worked diligently to clean the infection, but the king was not a patient patient, screaming at them to work faster, cursing their incompetence. Fever set in, and with it came delirium. He ranted about betrayal, about how the realm was full of vipers waiting to strike him. He called out for his crossbow at odd hours, threatening to shoot the shadows. Maegor stood vigil once, but Joffrey, in a haze of fever, hurled a bottle of poppy milk at him and shrieked for him to leave. Margaery tried to calm Joffrey, but he only snarled that she was in league with the boy who wanted to usurp him. The infection worsened. One evening, the maesters convened outside the king's chambers in hushed voices, discussing whether to amputate the leg to save his life. But Joffrey, overhearing their whispers, roared in defiance. He would not be dismembered. He demanded they find another way. Over the next day and night, they attempted stronger poultices, prayers to the Seven, but nothing worked. Joffrey's leg blackened with gangrene. His screams subsided into delirious moans, and his eyes glazed with terror, as if he knew the stranger was near. On the third day, the king's breathing grew shallow. Tywin, Jaime, Cersei, and Margaery gathered outside the door. The stench of rot filled the corridor, and the entire Red Keep seemed draped in gloom. Finally, in the deepest hour of the night, King Joffrey Baratheon breathed his last. The legacy of the boy king who had terrorized so many was over. Yet in its wake stood a new presence, one shaped from that same legacy but also by Margaery's gentle influence and Tywin's calculated grooming. By rights of inheritance, Prince Maegor was now King Maegor Baratheon, first of his name, heir to the Iron Throne. At just 16, he found himself poised to rule a realm that was simultaneously relieved at Joffrey's passing and uncertain of what to expect from the new king. The morning after Joffrey's death, Tywin summoned the lords of the Small Council, declaring that they must conduct a swift coronation to ensure stability. Cersei, inconsolable in her grief, insisted on a proper mourning period, but Tywin knew the realm could not linger in uncertainty. Preparations began immediately for a funeral service and a coronation. Margaery moved like a wraith through the corridors, grappling with her own tumult of emotions. She had been wed to a monster, endured his cruelty, and borne his child. Joffrey's death brought her a sense of release, yet also a swirling dread. Would Maegor become another tyrant? Or had she planted enough seeds of compassion to guide him? She knelt in the September, praying for guidance, for the child she had once cradled in her arms, for the realm that would soon kneel to him. The coronation was held in the great September of Baelor. Lords and ladies gathered, many wearing their house colors in a display of unity or silent defiance, depending on their secret sentiments. Maegor stood at the altar, clad in black and gold vestments, his expression solemn. He looked every bit a king, tall and composed, hair shining like a crown of its own. The High Septon anointed him with the sacred oils, invoking the blessings of the Seven. As he placed the crown, a heavy circlet of gold set with rubies, on Maegor's head, the new king's face betrayed little, only a steely resolve. Then Maegor turned to face the congregation, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobility, the silent watchers in the benches, and finally resting on Margaery. She stood near the front, hands clasped together, eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He inclined his head ever so slightly, the barest acknowledgement of her, before addressing the crowd. His voice rang clear in the vast sept, echoing off the marble walls. He declared that he would rule with wisdom, that he would protect the realm from threats both within and without. He promised justice for all, in a tone so measured that it was difficult to glean its sincerity. Applause followed, though uncertain and scattered at first, rising to a more robust cheer as the vow ended. The bells tolled the hour of the new king. Outside, The people strained to catch a glimpse of him as he emerged. White doves were released in celebration, fluttering into the sky. Gold cloaks lined the streets, ensuring order. The city did not erupt in the unbridled jubilation that had once greeted King Robert, but nor did it tremble in silent fear as it had under Joffrey's rule. Instead, there was a cautious curiosity. A new era had begun. In the days after, Maegor convened the small council. He listened to Tywin's advice regarding the finances, heard from the Master of Ships about the Iron Islands threat, and consulted with the Master of Laws on how to handle the rebel lords who had been subdued under Joffrey. Margaery watched from a corner of the council chamber, not officially a member, but present in her capacity as Queen Mother. She was struck by how calmly Maegor presided, absorbing information without the impulsive outbursts Joffrey had so often displayed. He made decisions swiftly, but not irrationally, and he often took a moment to consider each voice at the table before passing judgment. One of Maegor's first acts was to issue a general pardon for minor crimes committed by lords during the chaos of Joffrey's rule, provided they swore fealty anew to the crown. To Margaery, this seemed an encouraging sign, a gesture that might mend wounds. However, he also made it clear that any lord suspected of future disloyalty would be met with swift, possibly brutal retribution. There was no warmth in his tone as he delivered this ultimatum, only cold certainty. The message was clear. He would temper the realm with mercy and justice, but no one was to cross him. The funeral for Joffrey was held shortly after, a somber affair draped in black. Cersei wept bitterly, Jaime stood stoic, and Tywin observed with a grim solemnity. Maegor paid his respects with dignity, though none mistook it for genuine sorrow. Many approached Margaery to offer condolences for her husband's death. She accepted them gracefully, aware that many in truth were relieved. When the pyre burned, and the last vestige of Joffrey's reign turned to ash, Margaery felt a weight lift from her soul, tempered by the knowledge that her son now wore the crown. In the following weeks, King Maegor reorganized the court. He granted certain titles and positions, rewarding knights who had proven competent in the war. He reaffirmed alliances with the Tyrells, ensuring that Highgarden's support would continue. He summoned envoys from Dorne, the Vale, and the North, seeking a fragile peace. At face value, his actions seemed prudent, even benevolent. Some among the small folk began to whisper that the new king might actually be a blessing, if he could maintain stability and avoid his father's excesses. Yet darker rumors circulated in hushed corners of the Red Keep. Servants muttered that Maegor conducted closed-door meetings with certain men of shadowy reputation. They said that once a week, in the dead of night, the new king visited the bowels of the castle, where old dungeons lay unused. None knew what he did there, only that strange sounds were sometimes heard. The gold cloaks maintained silence, presumably following their king's orders. It brought a new tension to the fortress, as if an undercurrent of fear lingered just beneath the official veneer of measured governance. Margaery, observing all this, sought a private audience with her son. She found him in the royal solar, perched at a table stacked with scrolls. He greeted her politely, even warmly, offering her a seat. She dared to question him about the rumors, to which he responded with a calm, almost dismissive shrug. He explained that a king must be vigilant against hidden threats, that he was rooting out treachery. When she pressed him, he assured her that none of his methods exceeded what was necessary to protect the realm. She tried to read his face, searching for any sign of remorse or cruelty. All she found was an inscrutable wall. Their conversation shifted to the future of the kingdom. Maegor expressed a desire to secure the line of succession. He spoke of marriage, of forging new alliances. Margaery felt a pang, recalling how young he still was. But she nodded, acknowledging that the realm would demand it. With a quiet resolve, Maegor informed her that he intended to propose a match that would strengthen ties to the Vale. Lady Anya Aaron's granddaughter was a suitable candidate, well regarded for her intelligence. It was a typical political arrangement, yet Margaery couldn't help wondering if her son would ever know true love or if he would always be guided by cold necessity. Time marched on. The realm began to settle under Maegor's rule. Taxes were collected with a new efficiency that reminded many of Tywin's earlier hand in governance. The roads were patrolled, the gold cloaks enforced order, and while the common folk were not lavished with prosperity, they at least felt some measure of safety. The rumors of secret brutality still clung to the court, stories of a spymaster who carried out Maegor's orders in the darkness, disappearing would-be rebels and conspirators without a trace. But no open rebellions flared, and trade even saw a modest increase as merchants once more trusted King's Landing's stability. Margaery found herself relegated to a curious position as Queen Mother. She was respected by many for her grace and politeness, even admired by some who remembered how she had soothed the capital's anxieties when she first arrived as Joffrey's bride. Yet her influence over Maegor was limited. He seemed to seek her advice occasionally, but as soon as she ventured to counsel mercy or caution in certain policies, he would listen with a slight tilt of his head, give a non-committal acknowledgement, and then proceed with whatever course of action he deemed best. She continued to host charitable events for the small folk, distributing bread and floral tokens, attending services in the September to maintain a pious image. The people loved her for it, calling her the Rose of the Red Keep. But that affection did not necessarily extend to her son, who remained an enigmatic figure in the public eye. As the months stretched into a year of Maegor's reign, the initial cautious optimism began to fade. Some lords who opposed the crown disappeared, quietly or violently. Tax burdens grew in certain regions to fund a grand navy construction project. The king's justice was carried out more frequently, with traitors losing their heads in the throne room. Maegor, though not given to Joffrey's flamboyant cruelties, displayed a calculated ruthlessness that some found even more terrifying. Margaery observed these developments, torn between her maternal devotion and her moral compass. She had once prayed that the child of Joffrey Baratheon might not inherit his father's cruelty. Now she saw a man who was neither a mirror image of Joffrey nor a gentle soul. He was something more dangerous, a king who combined intelligence, discipline, and an undercurrent of remorselessness. She recalled the name he had been given, Maegor, conjuring the memory of Maegor the Cruel from Targaryen history. She could not help but fear that name had prophesied this very destiny. And yet, a part of her refused to surrender hope. She remembered nights reading stories to him, when he had rested his head against her lap, listening intently. She remembered his decision at age 8, when he refused to pit caged animals against each other, defying Joffrey's appetite for brutality. She remembered how he had chosen cunning over open slaughter in certain battles. There were glimmers that perhaps his cruelty was controlled, not impulsive. Maybe he could learn to lean on reason rather than fear. Perhaps, with enough patience and enough counsel, he might yet choose a path that truly benefited the realm. But time, she knew, had a habit of grinding all hopeful illusions into dust in the brutal land of Westeros. She watched her son ascend the Iron Throne, its twisted metal absorbing the torchlight in the throne room. She recalled the day she had first learned she was pregnant, the terror that had gripped her at the thought of Carrie, Ng Joffrey's child. Now that child was king, and as Margaery stood near the base of the throne, her eyes on Maegor's impassive face, she felt the weight of those years pressing down. A hush fell over the assembled courtiers, each waiting for the new king's next decree. In that charged silence, Margaery realized the cruel bloodline might indeed continue through this young man, her son, who held the fate of the 7 kingdoms in his poised hands. And she prayed to the 7 that, if any trace of kindness still flickered in his soul, it would guide him before the realm drowned once again in fire and blood. In the moons that followed, Maegor's rule crystallized into a blend of authoritarian efficiency and cautious reforms. A few lords who had grown too comfortable skimming taxes found themselves quickly replaced by more capable, loyal stewards. A subtle crackdown on corruption within the Red Keep pleased many who hated the long-time culture of bribes. Yet it also created fear among those who dealt in the shadows. Peasants in distant villages saw roads improve, though they were heavily taxed for it. There were no large-scale revolts, but the tension remained, a thick, unspoken wariness that the king was always watching. Margaery once tried to confront her son directly about the disappearances of certain nobles, men who had once come to her with petitions and never returned from their scheduled audiences. Maegor's calm response was that they had been found guilty of treasonous plots, that it was his duty to remove threats to the crown. When she begged him to let the courts or the council review such accusations, he replied that swift justice was often the best deterrent. He showed no anger toward her pleas, only a cool finality that told her the debate was at an end. Despite the gravity of the times, life persisted in the Red Keep. Banquets were held, albeit less ostentatious than in Joffrey's days. Foreign ambassadors visited from Essos, and the seasons marched on. Rumors that Maegor intended to forge a new alliance through marriage were confirmed when envoys from the Vale arrived. A betrothal contract was signed, and soon preparations for a royal wedding were underway. Margaery assisted in planning, ensuring it would be a grand affair that projected stability and power. She met the bride-to-be, Lady Alice Arryn, a soft-spoken but sharp-minded young woman. In their brief conversation, Lady Alice confessed her trepidation, though she tried to hide it behind polite smiles. Margaery offered reassurance, though her own heart was uncertain. On the morning of the wedding, the Great September was adorned with flowers from Highgarden, golden draperies, and the sigils of House Arryn and House Baratheon Lannister. The marriage proceeded smoothly. Maegor stood tall, regal in black and gold, while Lady Alice wore ivory silk. Vows were exchanged. The High Septon bound their hands with ribbons, and the crowd cheered. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, as if even in celebration, no one dared forget the looming shadow of the new king's unpredictability. After the wedding, Margaery and Maegor shared a quiet moment in a secluded cloister of the September Gardens. She embraced him, offering a mother's blessing. He thanked her, his tone softer than usual, acknowledging that her planning made the ceremony seamless. She dared to ask if he was pleased with the match. He replied that Lady Alice would be a dutiful queen, that he respected her intelligence. Margaery probed gently. Did he feel any affection for her? Any spark of happiness? Maegor paused, then spoke words that chilled Margaery to the core. A king's happiness is fleeting, mother. The realm needs a strong ruler more than I need love. The wedding feast that followed was splendid, but lacked the raucous edge once common under Joffrey. There were no dwarfs in mock justs, no cruel japes at the expense of the guests. Instead, musicians played solemn ballads, acrobats performed refined routines, and dishes of rich food were served. The highlight was a spectacular lemon cake tower made by the Red Keep's finest bakers. Maegor and Alice shared the first slice politely, then accepted the homage of the lords who approached. Margaery watched from a distance, seeing how some bowed deeply, others merely inclined their heads. The line between respect and fear had never been more blurred. As night fell, the newlyweds were escorted to their chambers. Margaery lingered in her own room, fighting an urge to weep for the uncertain future. She had tried to shape her son for the better, but Westeros had a way of shaping kings according to its own brutal logic. She prayed to the mother for guidance, for mercy. Then she closed her eyes, recalling the child she had held in her arms so many years ago, the wide-eyed baby with hair like spun gold. In the year that followed, King Maegor's reign hardened further. The Iron Bank was finally appeased with a major repayment that involved raising tariffs on trade. The Rose Road was fortified, and alliances with Highgarden deepened, ensuring food supplies remained stable. Some praised Maegor for bringing about a new era of stability and discipline, but others whispered that he was forging a tyranny in gold and blood, a quieter evil than Joffrey's overt sadism, yet perhaps even more inescapable. The new queen, Alice, bore him a child, yet another boy with bright Lannister gold hair. Margaery saw the infant and felt her heart ache, wondering if the cycle would repeat. Another royal child, shaped by an environment of subtle fear, bound to inherit the sins of his father and grandfather. Yet in public, Margaery Tyrell, once the bride of a cruel boy-king, maintained her composure, her grace. She gave alms to the poor, ensured the palace gardens thrived, and stood by her son's side at feasts, a serene pillar of support. In rare private moments, mother and son exchanged few words of genuine warmth. Sometimes Maegor would place his hand over hers and say, "All I am, I owe in part to you," and Margaery would manage a thin smile, uncertain whether to feel pride or sorrow. Over time, the name King Maegor Baratheon became etched into the chronicles of Westeros. Historians would debate his rule for generations, weighing the relative peace and order he imposed against the ruthless methods he used to maintain it. Some claimed he was a wise king, undone by his father's legacy, forced to rule through fear to prevent the realm from fracturing. Others argued he was merely a more refined monster, carrying forward the cruel bloodline that had begun with Joffrey. The truth, as always, was not so simple. In the dusk of her own years, Margaery would wander the Red Keep's silent corridors, remembering how it all began. Her wedding day to Joffrey, the birth of Maegor, the glimmer of hope she had clung to. She would stand in the courtyard where Maegor once held a wooden sword at the age of 5, thrusting it toward straw dummies. She would recall the afternoons she spent reading stories of chivalry and kindness to him, trying to nourish what gentle spirit might lie buried within. And she would wonder, with a deep, eternal ache, if her love had ever truly reached him, or if his father's cruelty had always burned too brightly, woven too tightly into his blood. The realm, for its part, would continue under King Maegor's iron-fisted stability. Wars might come and go, lords might rise and fall, but the Red Keep would echo with the footsteps of a king who learned from cruelty, refined it with cunning, and embodied it with a composure that both entranced and terrified his subjects. For better or worse, Joffrey's bloodline endured, and in Maegor, it had found its perfect vessel. A child once born with hope for a kinder future, now standing resolute at the pinnacle of power, casting a long, ominous shadow across the 7 kingdoms. And thus the story continued, each chapter in the grand tapestry of Westeros woven with threads of love, ambition, violence, and regret, always circling back to the question of how one might escape a cruel bloodline, or if such a destiny was inevitably bound in the marrow of one's bones. Margaery, left to her prayers and her fading roses, could only hope the gods might yet show mercy upon her son, and upon the realm that knelt to him.